Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Gary Starr, and I'm the Executive General Manager of Business, Government and International here at Australia Post. I'm thrilled to be hosting today's webinar, which is the second in our Australia Post Connect series. As you would know, this series of webinars was really all about exploring some of the many issues that businesses and governments are facing today. Now, I'd like to start with an acknowledgement to country. We have people all over Australia joining us today, and given the virtual nature of events these days, the acknowledgement to country covers all country. So I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we operate, live and gather, and recognise their continuing connection to land, water and community. Now, I'm joining you today from the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and we pay respect to elders past, present and emerging. Now, before we get into the discussion, I'll give you some tips on how to make the most of the platform we're using today. Whether this is the first time you've been involved or if you need a refresher, I'll just quickly cover some of the key things you need to know. Now, if you have any questions during the webcast, please submit these via the Q&A widget. We'll answer as many of these as possible during the Q&A session with our panel. You can configure the windows on your screen, so if you want to make them larger or smaller to suit yourself, please do so. And at the end of the event, we'd love your feedback. It should take a minute or so only. It's the second last widget on your console. And then finally, there's an on-demand version of the webcast, and that'll be out within 24 hours. You can use the email that you got with the link to this live event, but we'll also send out an email so you know when it's available and can access it through that email. And just repeating, we really want to see lots of questions from you, so add them anytime. Okay, so now let me set the context for our discussion. So whilst the disruption caused by COVID-19 has presented genuine challenges for businesses and governments around the country, it's also brought some incredible examples of ingenuity and resilience to the fore. We've seen healthcare providers rapidly shifted to telehealth so that they could provide critical access and essential advice when we needed it most. And of course, for my colleagues and I, we've experienced directly the impact on retailers where they've sped up their own digital transitions and they've had to adapt very quickly to government restrictions and yet have had record-breaking online shopping results. And we saw in the month just passed in August was our biggest month ever and the biggest in online shopping history and bigger than the peak period over Christmas. And there, of course, in other sectors, educators, workplaces and service providers pivoted to video to keep people and communities connected at a time when physical connection wasn't possible. I'm sure some of you have seen digital transformations that would have taken years have happened in a matter of months, often under really difficult circumstances. And whilst this quick adaptation was remarkable, it's also highlighted and perhaps even broadened some of the gaps that continue to exist in our society. So these changes have been convenient and even life-changing for some, and we've seen that massive acceleration in digital shift. And I mentioned healthcare and education and, of course, financial services as well. But these often excluded the 2.5 million people in Australia who do not have internet access. Now, some of those are without access by choice, but many because of financial, geographical or circumstantial barriers. And the federal government's vision for Australia to be a leading digital economy and society by 2030 is a great aspiration, and it will position Australia to compete effectively on the global stage. But we do have to consider citizen inclusivity, because this will be critical as the government aims, amongst other things, for 100% of services to be available online. At Australia Post, we're fortunate. We have a long-standing and trusted position in communities across Australia, particularly in regional and rural areas, where we're focused on providing equity of access to the core services we provide. In fact, we know that many underrepresented sections of society are more likely than the general population to visit a post office to use our services, such as people with a disability or perhaps those who are socially isolated. And I see this every time I travel in regional and rural areas and visit the local post offices in these communities. So whilst we are happy that we can support a broad range of customers in this way with access to tailored over-the-counter services, the digital inclusion gaps still exist. And so the question is, how can we ensure that all Australians have equitable and convenient access to services? Equal access to services is something we all deserve, and that's exactly what we're here to explore today. Now, I'm joined today by someone in a unique position to discuss these concerns and whose organisation is pivotal in promoting digital inclusion. Now, he probably needs no introduction, but I'll introduce him anyway. Andy Pennt is the CEO and Managing Director of Telstra, Australia's leading telecommunications company and the organisation behind the Australian Digital Inclusion Index. Telstra partnered with the Social Research Centre to develop this innovative digital inclusive tool. which is helping to inform and guide important discussions across business, not-for-profits, and all levels of government. And I know from the attendee list today that we have people from right across all sectors. Now, Andy will share insights about this digital inclusion landscape in Australia shortly and how we may be able to bridge the digital divide a bit further. We'll then be joined by Stella Avramopoulos, the CEO of Good Shepherd Australia and New Zealand, and Donna Stolzenberg, the CEO of the National Homeless Collective and the 2021 Victorian Australian of the Year. Both Stella and Donna work tirelessly to help those facing social disadvantage. So they'll be able to share the accessibility challenges being faced by vulnerable members of society and join the discussion on how businesses and government organisations of different sizes and in different sectors can work together to help ensure no Australian is left behind. So Andy, thanks for joining us today. I'd like to start with the basics just so we can level set with our audience and not assume they do know. So it'd be great if you could share what is digital inclusion and what factors are considered when assessing it. I know in simple terms, and you and I spoke a bit earlier, that people go straight to access to the internet and physical tools that they need to connect, but it's much more nuanced than that, isn't it?
Absolutely, Gary. And firstly, thank you for the opportunity to join this forum today. And well done to you and Australia Post for really provoking this conversation, because it's a really important one. And as you said, COVID has only accelerated the rate and pace of digital adoption, which on the one hand is a good thing, but as history has shown us, when technology changes, it is often those people that can least afford to that are most likely to get left behind in that transition. And so we started this Digital Inclusion Index going back about 7 years now. We've got the next edition coming up in October, and the reason we established it was to really create a fact-based time series of high-quality data on digital inclusion, because we know lots of policymakers, when they're adopting and recommending government interventions and government policies, whether it's at the federal, state or local council level, can value having that very independent data series. And to your point, so therefore, we created a framework to say, well, what is digital inclusion? And we really came up with 3 key measures of digital inclusion. The first is access, which as you just referred to, that is just very simply, is there internet coverage available in the area in which I live? And of course, in certain parts of Australia, remote and regional Australia, there isn't access available just because Australia is a very large country and providing telecommunications coverage to every square kilometre is very, very difficult and prohibitively expensive. So access is one point, but there's 2 other points which are equally important. And one is affordability. So I might be able to get access to telecommunications and to the internet, but can I afford it? And then the third one is digital, what we call digital literacy. So do I know actually how to use it when I've got access as well? And increasingly, and we saw this through COVID, is that more and more services are going online, including government services around Centrelink, and a lot of the packages that government put in place in response to COVID were actually only available digitally. So I need to be able to have access, I need to be able to afford it, but then I also need the skills to be able to access and to use my digital access effectively to continue to be digitally included. And we see issues in each one of those dimensions.
Right, and as I said, I guess access is one thing, but it's really clear that there's much more at play. And I mentioned earlier that there were about 2.5 million Australians who currently aren't online. You'd know better than most. 90% of households do have access to internet at home. But as you said, access doesn't necessarily equate to equality. And it's often those who already face barriers elsewhere that end up disadvantaged. So can you tell us just a bit more about these people? Like, who is most likely to be impacted by the digital divide?
Yeah, and to your point, pretty much 90% plus of houses are capable of getting access to the internet, but only about 70 to 75% do. And so where we see the most level of digital exclusion, if you like it, over 65s would be a good example, where I think about 1 in 5 people in the over 65 community do not have access to the internet or don't make that available to themselves for all sorts of different reasons. It may be affordability, it may just be nervousness and a lack of attitudinal issues about whether they feel safe using the internet or not. And so that is an important part of the community. And it's particularly important as well because, as you can imagine, during COVID, that part of our community is feeling even more isolated because of local restrictions. So over 65s is one. Indigenous communities is another. A lot of Indigenous communities may not have access to the internet, or maybe even where they do have access to the internet, they may not be able to afford it. And also there's cultural ways in which Indigenous communities work where they share devices, share plans, and things such as cyberbullying are becoming very important considerations. So Indigenous communities is another one. Another one is mobile-only users. So there's a lot of people out there who only have access to a mobile device and don't have internet at home. And so, again, they've got access to the internet, but they may not have it in a way which enables them to really use a personal computer or take advantage of many of the things that they need to do online. Particularly, I mean, for example, students from low-income households, I think there's something in the order of 800,000 students that are living in a household with an income of less than $35,000 a year. And of course, as we're needing to study online as well as during COVID, you can see how that becomes a very significant barrier to their education and their progression. And so I think, what we do find is that many of the groups that suffer from digital inclusion or digital exclusion face many of the same groups that are excluded in other ways from our communities and from our society as well. People with a disability would be another good example. People in remote communities would be another good example. And as we've said, during COVID, the importance of that digital inclusion has just been reinforced. There's lots of cohorts and sections in our community that we need to be conscious of, that we can support as much as we can.
Right, and there was one other, when you launched, I know the report's coming out soon, but when you launched it last year, one other data point that really stood out for me was the 20% of the population who have mobile access only, which we spoke about. And they typically, that means have access to less data, and the mobile data costs are higher than fixed broadband. So it costs more for access, so it's sort of a double whammy. But what's concerning is looking below that average 20%, as you mentioned, Indigenous Australians is at 35%, and that group in that fifth quartile that earn less than 35,000, it's higher again. So unfortunately, the most vulnerable are disadvantaged, as you said. I'm not sure there's an easy answer here, but it's something that we have to address as a high priority. I mean, do you have any thoughts there around how we address that further, short of rolling out more fixed broadband?
Well, I certainly think that having the database is really helpful. I mean, another example would be, you've got 3% of households with a high income are digitally excluded, whereas that number increases to nearly a third of households with a low income. And so you do see that digital inclusion or digital exclusion follows similar fault lines in the broader socio-economic society in which we live. But there are a number of initiatives that we can put in place to address it. So, and that's why breaking it down into those three categories is important. So access is important. The government has a mobile black spot program, which is providing coverage which might not otherwise be affordable. So far, we've put up something like 900 towers to communities that may not have otherwise had it. Now, to your point, it's still the case that mobile data tends to be more expensive than fixed data, but the NBN is gradually rolling out to all of those communities, and satellite technology is progressing, and that's going to help. Affordability is another important area, so supporting customers with affordable plans. We have a plan which we make available to anybody with a health card. That is it's a much cheaper plan, it's much more affordable, and that's helpful for them. And then digital literacy, we've got a number of programs in digital literacy. We've been running our Tech Savvy Seniors, which is a program targeted particularly at older people in the community. We've had more than 200,000 people go through that program over many years. We've got the Deadly Digital Initiative, which we roll out in Indigenous communities, which is it's about digital literacy, but it's also about digital safety as well. Access for Everyone is another initiative that we've implemented to try and provide accessibility for people with a financial hardship. Staying Safe Online and other programs. There's lots of initiatives, not just Telstra. I think, the other telcos are providing those as well. And so we've just got to find a way of connecting people from those communities with them, because, again, often, as is the case somewhat ironically with all of these things, they're available online. And so if people are digitally excluded in the first place, then it's not really very helpful having programs that are only accessible online. But obviously that's a much more effective and efficient way of getting them out to a broad section of our population.
Well, I'd appreciate it if you could get my parents onto that program for seniors. And I mean, they certainly have access to broadband, and their Telstra customers have access to 4G, but digital certificates, the vaccine certificates on their phones and the Medicare app have befuddled them. And all those government services that are going digital are great, but they were very anxious about being out in the community without being able to prove that they were vaccinated. So I'm sort of half joking, but it is a concern for more and more Australians in that age group who are sort of obliged now to use a mobile device to have credentials on, in hand at all times.
I think that's absolutely right, Gary. I mean, quite often these days, I had an appointment with my GP yesterday, and he had to give me a prescription, and the prescription turned up digitally on my mobile device, and turned up in a text, and I had to click the link and get a QR code, and then go to the pharmacy and use that, which was fine for me because I'm obviously very used to using technology. But for many people, it's quite disconcerting to maybe not leave the doctor's surgery, or maybe, to your point, it's a COVID vaccination certificate. A lot of that's being done digitally now, and people need the confidence and need help in terms of how they move to adopt those technologies so that they can actually not be excluded from society. And so I think, and as we've said a couple of times, COVID has only increased that. Services Australia is one of our biggest customers, as I know it is for you too. But during various different times, Services Australia has been responsible for JobKeeper, JobSeeker, Centrelink, for the vaccination record rollout, and for a lot of those sort of programs, for the hotline for the COVID vaccination. And a lot of that support has been provided digitally. And so, again, that's great. But if people are not included digitally and don't have access, can't afford it, don't know how to use it, then it's really not of much use to them. And so that's where we can play a really important role, I think.
Yeah, that's great. And to your point with Services Australia and DFAT and other federal government agencies, interestingly, you're working with them in the digital context. We are in that over-the-counter or a physical access where required, if someone needs to verify, or where they just can't get access to the services digitally. So it's an interesting combination of digital and, where required, physical over-the-counter, albeit that the physical channel is diminishing over time. More and more Australians do have access. And I guess I just call out to you, you mentioned a number of areas that you're helping close the gap, but one thing that was great to see was last month when you made payphones free for use within Australia. And just, I don't know if you have any of the stat, just what that's meant and who's picking up those phones and using them day to day.
Yeah, no, it's really fun to be able to do that. So most of us probably sit here and think, who else uses a payphone anymore? So there are 15,000 payphones still in Australia. That's down from about 35,000 2 decades ago, but there are still 15,000 around Australia. I love them. I think they're iconic. We probably have about 11 million calls a year going through those payphones. Of those, at least 250,000 are to a helpline of some description, so 8000 or some other type of lifeline support service. There are homeless people use them a lot. Victims of domestic violence, often a perpetrator of domestic violence will deliberately exclude their victim from having access to a mobile phone or communication, and literally they've got no way to communicate to the external world. So there's another opportunity and role there. And so it wasn't a tough decision for us to make it free. We also found, actually, interestingly, during national emergencies through the bushfires and the floods, that can often take out mobile towers. and so mobile coverage is often therefore a fixed line. A payphone was the only way to connect to the internet because we put Wi-Fi on a lot of them, and for people to connect to the outside world, and so they got a lot of use there. So anyway, we made a decision, as you said, a few weeks ago, Gary, to make them free, and I'm pleased to say that since we made that decision, the number of calls on payphones in Australia has tripled.
Wow. Oh, that's interesting. Well, that's great to hear. And look, thanks, Andy. It's great you helped us dig just a little bit into the report. It is certainly available online. I know I'm sure you'll have an event to launch the latest results. What's concerning to see is that some of the metrics have not moved far enough over the 7 years, and there's work to do. But I do think your the free payphone decision would certainly resonate with our other two panelists, who I'll introduce now. I guess we've touched on some of those interconnected social issues that can cause major accessibility barriers. But Stella and Donna know only too well what it means not to have access. And so let me just introduce them. Stella has been the CEO of Good Shepherd Australia New Zealand since February 2018. And for those who don't know, the Good Shepherd is a community services organisation that works to support women, children and families experiencing abuse or disadvantage. And it offers a range of practical services, including housing, financial wellbeing and access to safe and affordable finance. So welcome, Stella. And Donna Stolzenberg is the CEO of the National Homeless Collective, the NHC, which is a grassroots Australian organisation that helps people affected by homelessness, domestic violence and social disadvantage. So you can see the common theme there. The charity grew to life back in 2014, actually, when this index, when the data started being collected on this, after Donna set out on a mission to hand out 50 donated sleeping bags to homeless people, and it just grew from there. And then last October, as I mentioned, Donna was named the 2021 Victorian Australian of the Year for her tireless work. And that we are the category sponsor for this award, so we're obviously very proud to help celebrate inspiring Australians like Donna. So welcome, Donna, to both of you. Now, Stella, I'll start with you. I've briefly touched on the work of Good Shepherd, but could you give us a bit more of an overview of the type of work your team does, both on a strategic level, but also practically, what it means on the ground?
Sure, thank you. And can I also just begin by acknowledging that I'm meeting on the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. People don't know that we were actually founded some 400 years ago and are currently operating services in 73 countries around the world. Direct service delivery, responding to emerging needs for women, girls and their families, and the strategic systems change have always been part and parcel of everything we do and the way we do it. So in Australia in particular, we have a range of financial wellbeing programs, from financial counselling to financial coaching and capability building, all the way through to our no-interest loan scheme, looking at poverty and inequality. We also run housing and homelessness services. We run programs for children, youth and families in education, and specifically we have quite a significant number of family violence services, everything from the 24-hour crisis response through to family violence coaching programs and counselling programs post-violence. There's about 100,000 individuals and individuals we work with in any given year. And most recently, I guess, we have been focused, particularly in the COVID environment, of aligning our efforts and services with corporates and government, and getting better alignment in terms of that service response at a strategic level. When you're part of an organisation that literally has been responding for hundreds of years, you know that you've got to get to some upstream strategies, and we need to look at the broader systems and barriers that affect both poverty and inequality, particularly for women. And so we have quite a significant research, advocacy and policy team that looks at that and works with other organisations and government around those issues. We know that the higher the inequality and exclusion in a country, the higher is their index of social problems. So we really do need to get that systemic and structural approach to addressing what are some of our really wicked problems here in Australia.
Right. Well, thanks, Stella, and we'll come back to that financial assistance. I think we can talk about that a bit further. Now, Donna, I know it was a long time ago, but you were once a homeless mother of two. And as somebody who has experienced that level of disadvantage firsthand, how do personal circumstances like homelessness impact on what we've been talking about, on access and inclusion in other other areas of society?
Thanks, Gary. Yeah, it affects all areas of a person's life. So when someone's experiencing homelessness, I know that we have this gap in the digital inclusion, but when a person's experiencing homelessness, they're automatically further excluded. We know during COVID that a lot of the support that we do have in our day-to-day went online. So we're talking about telehealth and access to social services and all other areas of life. But when you're experiencing homelessness and you don't have access to the internet and those places where you used to access it might be closed because of COVID, then the person is even further removed from that support. And we're talking social support, we're talking support with employment, support with mental health disabilities. There might be substance concerns as well that the person is now further disadvantaged from because, they're even further locked out.
It's interesting. It just seems from there that things can spiral because it's just that much harder then to get help and to engage and stay connected.
It is, and the people are disconnected. So people who are at that experiencing homelessness, they're already disconnected because the majority of people would have connected with either a service or family or friends to be able to make sure that they didn't tumble into homelessness. And so we're already working with people who have that complete disadvantage already.
Right. Now, look, I mentioned a few minutes ago that looking at the results over 7 years, some of the metrics haven't moved. But I do know that when we can make a difference, the impact can be significant. And Stella, you spoke a little bit about financial assistance and other financial services to those in need. So from your perspective, what are some of the far-reaching impacts of having this access when it comes to social inclusion?
Sure. And can I just say addressing this is a multifaceted issue. So we don't just look at it from a singular frame. It's about working with the individual within the context of their family and working with them, and then that family within the context of that community. So there are three layers that social exclusion actually impacts and is impacted by. But over all of my years, I've got to I've boiled it down to three areas that you constantly see the impact. One is around confidence, the second is around capability, and the third is around connection. In terms of confidence, you can imagine for a woman who has experienced control and abuse for many, many years and most of her life perhaps, the lack of confidence she would have to actually pick up the phone and exercise her agency to do something about her situation and help herself. The trust and the fear of her, and in particular, from a digital perspective, the growing nature and issue around digital abuse, digitally enabled abuse that she's got to contend with. Imagine from a capability perspective, the skills and resources, it's both affordability and access and awareness, language, all of those issues form part of her capability to be able to actually exercise choice and navigate her way through various supports to find safety and recovery. From a connection perspective, we see women who really are disconnected and further isolated from their community, from their families. So working with them to really find the place in their community, their local community, their immediate family that they can support and connect to is really, really important. I guess those three dimensions are a constant theme, whether we're talking about family violence or financial stress.
Right. Thanks, Stella. And Andy, we've talked about understanding and addressing these issues of exclusion. But not only will they benefit those who are missing out, but also it's in the interest of the organisations that can be involved through increased productivity and economic measures. I'm sure the corporates in the audience would love you to share any examples here from Telstra's experience.
Yeah, no, look, I think we have long had a approach towards inclusion, and one of the big platforms to that has been flexible ways of working. And, going back almost a decade, we've had all roles flex at Telstra so that people can choose to do their work from where they want, and it's the role of the company and the manager to find a way to enable that rather than the other way around. And that was actually one of the reasons that we were able to shift so quickly to working from home during the impact of COVID. And we've really, if you like, invested further in that. We've just launched location agnostic contracts, which means, in other words, that term in your contract or letter of employment that used to say your ordinary place of business is XYZ, that no longer exists in our contracts. And so we're just trying to find new ways to be flexible, but it's also about diversity as well. We just trialled a neurodiversity recruitment program as a pilot over the last 6 months, really trying to find ways in which we can expand our employment to people with attention disorders, autism, dyslexia, dyspraxia. That's been a really interesting learning experience. Also working with the Cerebral Palsy Alliance on their accelerator program. So, really finding ways to enable people with, different skills, but different conditions that they're dealing with every day to make a contribution to society, to be part of the Telstra community and to play a role. And I think, COVID and the whole hybrid way of working is just, enabled us or accelerated our ability to be able to do that, because we can help and support people to work from where they want, when they want, and how they want. And that includes people with a disability and other aspects which might have otherwise previously excluding them from the workforce. Great.
It's an interesting dynamic that working from home, staying connected with colleagues, and then, of course, those in society who are struggling and the various services that they can avail themselves of. Now, Donna, you and the NHC team have developed sub-charities that sort of target different issues. So can you just share with us how some of these charities lead to greater social inclusion? Any examples there?
Yeah, so we've developed 9 different sub-charities that address almost all of the areas of homelessness. I think it's important to understand the role of NHC and how it differs to other charities, and that what we do is we really sit in that sort of unseen space between nothing and service. So there's amazing organisations like Good Shepherd who are doing amazing work, but there might be someone who isn't able to access that yet, or might be waiting for an appointment or to see someone. So our role is to support people while they're waiting, and we support the charities and other NGOs who are looking after these people. So we've identified 9 major areas, and I won't speak to all of those today because we don't have time, but a couple of the main ones that we have is a back to work program for people. We link with 2 other businesses who we employ people to do order fulfillment for them, and we have 2 other back to work programs. One of them is around food and nutrition and reigniting that passion and love for food and cooking. It's called the Plate Up Project, and that supports people who might have been spending a long time on the street or a long time away from your typical housing where they've been able to cook for themselves. And we reignite that passion for food and cooking, and also introduce work skills, food safety, barista courses, and make sure the person is connected not only to the people in the course, but also to any other hobbies they might have, and make sure that the person is able to express their own self-determination in navigating their own pathway out of homelessness, how they want this to happen, and on their own terms. We have other programs that support the physical needs of people, and we include a lot of volunteers volunteers there. We have people who are part of our cohort, those experiencing homelessness and social disadvantage, coming in and helping us to make the packs up and also volunteer with the organisation as well. So we're really like one, if you're housed or homeless, if you're employed or unemployed, it doesn't matter. We have everyone all in together, and we make sure that people have those avenues available to them to move forward in such a way that they are able to. We also have one of our employment programs, and this is a bit about what Andy was speaking to about flex time. We've kind of taken it a bit further and acknowledging that homelessness is a very chaotic experience to live and endure, and that a person may not actually have a home in which to work from. So working from home might not be an option. So we have workplaces that people can come to, but we've removed any start and finish times because our research told us that start and finish times were the main barrier to a person who was experiencing homelessness to be able to get back into the workforce. So we give people 15 hours a week available work, and if they want to work 2 of those hours or all 15 or anything in between, it's up to them, and they can just come into the workplace when they can. We make sure that the tasks that they're given are not time critical or mission critical, so they don't feel as though they're letting anyone down if they can't come in. And we've removed all necessity for explanation as to why the person isn't coming in, because we know that the reason they're not coming in is something intensely personal and most likely to do with their current circumstances.
Yes, and one of the stories I read was about, in terms of that flexibility with time, with someone sleeping on the street and having wet clothes and needing to get them, go to a laundromat to dry them before they could come to work. So that's a poignant story, but the flexibility time-wise to do that, really important, and hoping them to get back to a routine that works for them and back into the workforce ultimately, and giving their self-esteem a bit of a shot in the arm too as they are able to start to contribute. Now, Stella, Andy and Donna both sort of talked a little bit about the way Andy did it, particularly about corporate, working with corporates, and you've got some experience there, as well as community and government groups. So what have you learned about the power of these collaborations? And can you talk maybe about a couple of the best partnerships you've developed over time, and sort of what space they're in, and what were the outcomes? Why did they work?
Is that to me, Gary?
Yes.
Yes, sorry. I wasn't sure if it was. Look, we've got 2 back to work programs that we have developed with. One is a sanitary item company and one's an underwear company. And in consultation with these business owners, we have developed a program where people can come into work and work the hours that suit them, and then not put under any pressure. So a lot of times when you're doing any kind of pick and pack kind of work or factory work, you might be having to get a certain quota out per day, a certain amount of units out. Well, we abolish that and make sure that people are able to work their best day for them, and nobody is admonished for not getting as many items out as somebody else. And we have both of those going on, and they've been going on for some time now. We've employed quite a few women in that program. Interestingly, another program that we did actually start was with Telstra, and this is before one of the T22 reshuffles, and we had the one of the managers of the I think it was one of the software development groups, and we were actually working on an app that people who are experiencing homelessness could use, and so they would be able to open this app, and then all of the services available to them would be available right there. They'd be able to see opening times and not waste their time and their data trying to contact organisations that were perhaps no longer in existence or redundant or not available to them. And it was also a website involved in that as well. So I'd love to pick that up with you at some stage, Andy, because it was the outcome of that was absolutely amazing. But unfortunately, the manager, I think, chose employment elsewhere. But we had the staff ready to use their volunteer days to develop this app, and in consultation with all the other organisations around as well. So so that was on the cards, but unfortunately things kind of didn't move forward. But it's still something I think people could definitely use.
Well, certainly, I would have been surprised if you were still. You guys didn't ask Andy some way along the way. Always looking for opportunities. And Stella, I guess you had similar experience. So any other examples from you around partnerships?
We've had quite significant corporate collaborations and sort of what I call cross-sector, multi-stakeholder coalitions that we build, and mainly because we know after so many years, no one sector is actually going to address issues like financial exclusion and domestic and family violence. So for the last 18 years, NAB has been providing a loan book and support to the no interest loans scheme. It's one of the biggest corporate investments and partnerships around financial inclusion. Last year, the CBA made one of the largest investments and co-investments in family violence by supporting us to deliver financial independence hub, providing financial coaches for women post-family violence over the next 4 years to 10,000 women. Increasingly in this COVID world, and COVID's been this big x-ray machine on all of those areas of our society that just don't work, and new emerging vulnerable cohorts that we've never seen before, but they are the customers of all of these corporates. So we're really working hard and fast in a number of hardship referral programs to be able to just stem the flow. Unlike many of their businesses, I'm actually not in the business of growing business. I want to reduce more ambulances at the bottom of the hill at a kind of even bigger program of work. In 2014, the Australian government committed at the G20 summit, the Development and National Financial Inclusion Action Plan, to advance the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. So Good Shepherd was commissioned to lead that program along and supported by Ernst & Young and the Centre for Social Impact. Since that time, 50 organisations are now part of and have their own FIAPs that promote financial wellbeing across Australia, that both at a strategic and practical level within each of those organisations. Those organisations employ 250,000 people, and collectively they service over 80% of the Australian population. It is something that I think now in a COVID environment and with our recovery in the coming years is more important than ever to actually come together and look at what are the social, financial exclusion and inequality issues we've got to address, because the numbers just keep going the wrong way, folks. And we've actually got this moment now to really kind of focus and come together on developing these plans jointly and collectively. And there was one in Geelong, for example, that was 10 organisations. Geelong did a place-based one just before COVID started, and thank God they did. Deakin, who was part of that, actually was able to employ students who'd lost their jobs as COVID-safe officers as a result of being part of that initiative. So there are a lot of great things that corporates are starting to really get behind. I want co-investment to be considered as the platform for corporate and government that can align around the efforts that community services have been endeavouring to address all of these systemic issues for many, many years. And I think we've got this one moment in time with all of us together on that.
Well, and I think as we heard, Andy spoke about a number of the initiatives Telstra has in place. Hopefully some of those listening today, both government and corporates, can have a think about that and see how they can get involved. So look, actually before we'll go to questions, because we have a few, there are only questions for Andy so far. For any questions for Stella or Donna, please do use the Q&A tool to add the questions, and I'll come to the questions. But just to sort of tie that back together, the no interest loan scheme that you mentioned, one of the many things you mentioned then, Stella, I read an article about that, and it ties back to what Andy talked about, access and affordability when it talked about digital inclusion, is families who can barely afford school, the cost of the textbooks, and they're now virtually, because it's virtual schooling, need a computer or an iPad or some device. And the no interest loan scheme is one way to avail themselves of the device so the children can keep learning. And that's both tied to access and affordability, I guess. So a real challenge, but something that it's great to see that families have that access. So I may now go to the questions. The first one's an easy one, Andy, which is where can I get access to the digital inclusion report? I assume they can Google that online, I assume.
Yeah, no, you can Google it online. We've been issuing the report, as I mentioned, for 7 years. It's going to be fascinating because the 2021 version of the report gets released, I think, next month. And the last report because it's a survey, and we were in market surveying in March of 2020. So the reason this year is going to be fascinating is arguably last year's report didn't have in it the impact of COVID. And so the impact and how people in our community have been able to respond to that, and of course their increased dependency on being connected digitally to avoid social isolation and economic isolation, has increased in importance over the last 12 or 18 months because of all the restrictions that we've all been under. And so it's going to be fascinating to see that report. But yes, go online and you can get it. And then look out also for the latest edition, which it gets released next month.
And I think you're right, Andy. Reading through that report in detail a few weeks ago, it'll be fascinating to see a full year of COVID and just some of the fundamental changes. And I wonder where gaps have perhaps sadly increased, or whether some gaps have closed because of that rapid acceleration in some activities to try to manage in a virtual world. So it'll be fascinating to see. Okay, there is a question. I'll come back to Andy. There is a question for Donna. A good question. Hi, Donna. What is the best way to make a donation to the National Homeless Collective? Have we lost your audio there, Donna? I don't know if you're muted.
Yes, I am.
Do you want to answer that question, Donna?
Yes, thank you. The best way to make a donation is to head to our website, which is nhcollective.org.au. And I will take the opportunity to let everyone know that we actually have a raffle. There's 4 of them at the moment, and 100% of the proceeds do come to us, and 100% of those proceeds are used to support people experiencing homelessness. At the moment, because of COVID, we are very restricted as far as tangible goods donations and volunteerism. It has made things very, very awkward, but it is still possible to donate, and know that those donations will be helping us very much. Thank you.
Great, thanks. And now, Andy, a question from David, and it's one that I'm interested in your answer, and we're certainly wrestling with, and that is, do you see identification becoming digital? And it's a real challenge if you don't have a smartphone.
Yeah, well, we were talking, weren't we, Gary, just before about some of the initiatives that the government is looking at through Services Australia, and one of those is digital identity, and it's something that the government is particularly focused on at the moment, as much as anything to try and improve cyber security. In another part of my life, I chair the government's industry advisory board on cyber security, and we've seen a dramatic increase in malicious cyber activity targeted at individuals, particularly during COVID. And identity is one of the sort of biggest risk areas. If you lose your digital identity or lose identity, then that opens you up to a whole range of vulnerabilities from a cyber security point of view. But to your point, but behind David's question, again, obviously, if you're going to need increasingly a digital identity to access government and related services, then it's a problem. If you're not digitally included, you don't have access to a smartphone to enable you to have that digital identity. So it's definitely another area of growing importance, and one where we've got to make sure that in the initiatives that are being implemented to roll out digital identity more fulsomely across the country, that again, we don't leave those parts of our community behind that can least afford to be left behind.
I think that's right. And just 2 points on that, Andy. One is, I know when you talk about digital literacy, one of the 3 dimensions, that it includes not just my parents being able to use the technology, but the fear of cyber and trusting the wrong people, bad actors and all that. What you talk about cyber is another big piece around digital literacy. In terms of that digital identity, I mean, we at Australia Post, we're big supporters of digital identity. We actually we were very early to market with a digital identity capability, but we do see some sort of physical failover or channel required from time to time. And yes, it may be diminishing over time, and hopefully one day, all citizens can avail themselves of digital access, but to keep all citizens engaged, a physical sort of channel is probably still required. And that's a good segue to a question for Donna and Stella from Melanie, which is, some people just prefer person-to-person contact when assessing services. Donna and Stella, do you have any ideas around how corporates could provide access to their services to your more vulnerable communities? Maybe I'll start with Stella and then go to Donna.
I think the issue is choice and walking with someone, whether it's recovery from family violence. It's really being able to engage people at the point that they feel most confident and capable to engage. During COVID, where we were not able to do, for example, outreach and face-to-face counselling, we set up a contact centre, and believe it or not, the phone was the number one place for people to want to access us. They wanted the conversation. With the navigation and just the overwhelming nature of what COVID brought forward and the stress people were feeling. And we actually did some research through Roy Morgan on this. Australians were incredibly overwhelmed around how to navigate help for themselves, and they needed a phone call. They needed to be able to contact someone back when a referral to an organisation didn't work out or they couldn't get the right paperwork, etc. So it really is about what is it that individual actually needs to engage in, asking them firstly what's their preference and where do we start. Often we find that we start with a phone call and face-to-face and then can move them to text messaging or some kind of online referral and access point. But really it's about having that client choice and working with people at the point that they are at, and working on their confidence and working on their capability to be better connected in the future.
Right, great. Thanks, Stella. And Donna, anything you want to add to that, or any other ideas around access to services for more vulnerable communities?
Yeah, I think we need to understand how complex the services are and how convoluted it is for people to actually get support. All of the support services have no plug-in system, which is another area of technology we really need as a society to look at, where services that support people experiencing homelessness and social disadvantage are able to speak to each other. It's one of the very, very few industries where they can't. And so I can't see, if Stella's organisation is looking after one of my clients, I can't see what's happening at that end. And as a result, we have a system where we require the user to navigate it themselves. And we've got people at the lowest point in their life and people who are going through the most traumatic experiences. And then we say to them, you need to navigate your way out of this, which is completely unfair. So the system needs to be remodeled. We also need to understand that digital inclusion should be seen as important and necessary as access to basic services and basic utilities, and that digital inclusion, the gap is widening. Although we have a lot of different technology coming up, the gap to those services is actually widening, and the Digital Inclusion Index actually speaks to that as well. And what we see with society, there's this attitude that needs to change. I've had so many people say to me, oh, I saw a homeless guy and he had a mobile phone, so he can't be homeless, or what's he doing with a mobile phone? I actually heard a very prominent radio announcer laughing about a man that he saw sitting on the street with his iPhone, and everyone thought it was hilarious. And, I was heartbroken because they didn't realise that for a person to survive these days out there, they need to have that access to that information. So we need a shift of the societal attitudes that it is fair and right and just for someone going through this to be able to have access to that digital inclusion like everybody else does, and find ways to include them in that and make sure that they're not left further behind.
Right, that's a great answer, and there's a question here sort of related for Andy in terms of vulnerable citizens. So Andy, this is from Michael. Do you see a role for telcos to play in ensuring access for vulnerable citizens to government services, for example, data-free access to government sites? And to the point of I have a phone and it's my only tether. I'm tethered. That's the only way I'm tethered. How the telco sector could play a role there.
Yeah, no, look, and to Donna's point, just picking up on that, for a lot of homeless people, actually, the mobile phone is one of the only things that they do have in their personal possession, and it's so important for them to keep connected. In many ways, it's the only lifeline. In fact, we did a partnership with Ask Izzy about 5 years ago. Ask Izzy is an application where you can basically, as a homeless person, you can go on there and various different services which are available, whether it's laundries or accommodation or food or other types of services, post on there so that as a homeless person I can find where I can get access to some of these services. and we unmeter those. In other words, what we do is we make sure that when somebody is using access to those services, they're not using any of their data allowance. And in fact, in the last financial year, ending June, there were something like 2.3 million searches for help using Ask Izzy, and more than half of those were from a Telstra device, which was unmetered. We have had discussions with government around also unmetering access to their services on their sites, and that's absolutely something that we can do as well. It requires the government to play a role in that as well, by the way. So, and we do that on various different sort of emergency services and otherwise, and other charities as well. So, look, I think, the telcos obviously play a critical role in the sense that they provide the key platform for access, but I think, government candidly has a responsibility to make those services accessible. So if Services Australia is going to put more and more welfare type of services only available online, then I think they've got a role to play in making sure that people in the community can get access to those services online as well.
I think that's a great answer, and we do have representatives from across all the federal and state governments. So, I think that's a great answer, and I'm sure they've heard that. Maybe I'll go to just in the spirit of time, the last question, which is really to all, and a quick answer which is from Alex, and that is, what are some of the most important things to consider when trying to develop partnerships that can enhance inclusion? So I may start with Stella. When you think about those partnerships that have really worked, what do you consider that one's going to work, and why?
That there is awareness of the issues, and a genuine commitment that we are actually co-responsible for the outcome. That we do have a client-centred approach and really start with where people are at and understand what the issues that are preventing them are, in terms of, from their confidence to their capabilities, skills, awareness, affordability, and all of those issues, and that we are connecting them appropriately. And really not creating the cracks for them in the future to fall through. There's a lot of referrals that go through this unstitched patchwork quilt of a service system, but people need to know how to navigate it, and that we are with them and hanging in there, and that they have a place and a port of call to go back to when they hit a wall, a system, or an inability to actually get the supports that they need, and hanging in there for the longer term. This is not quick fix stuff.
Right. Great message, isn't it? Donna, what about you?
I agree with everything that Stella has said, and one of the things that we often get asked is for corporates to come and do volunteer days with us, which we welcome. However, it's always on the corporate's terms, and I would really like to put it out there that it would be nice to be asked first what we need. We often get corporate organisation, big banks and that coming to us and saying, hey, look, we've got 30 employees for one day and they're all coming at once, and what can you make us do? What have you got for us? And that doesn't work for us. And in forming these partnerships, I think it's really important for any organisation to look at what it is that we're trying to achieve for the clients that we service and see what we can develop from there, rather than having a preconceived idea about what that partnership will look like. It's great to come to the table with some ideas, but be open to the fact that they might not work because you're a business and we're working with a completely different cohort of people.
Great. And finally, Andy, from the other side, from the corporate side, any final ideas from you around that?
Yeah, no, look, I think what I would say, Gary, is there's a lot of great intent out there, and a lot of people wanting to really make a difference and really help. And so therefore, I think what's important is that we identify unique solutions to unique problems and be very clear about how they connect back into the system. We don't want to add inefficiency and confusion. Be very clear about what the problem is that the particular partnership or the initiative is trying to solve, how it's trying to solve it in a unique way, and then really get behind that. Because otherwise, I think we're just creating more noise, and you've got different services competing with each other, which is frankly unhelpful.
Great. Okay, well, thanks, Andy. And look, our time is up. There are more questions, and I apologise we didn't get to all of them. But a big thank you to our panellists, and Andy, Stella and Donna, for sharing your experiences and insights with us. I think people will leave who didn't know about digital inclusion a little more about digital inclusion, understanding that, that it's more than just connectivity or access, and how it is so connected to social inclusion and the impact on our most vulnerable. And also we've talked a little bit just now about partnerships. I think there's some really good sort of learnings in that around how we can help and to really make it matter. So thank you, of course, to all of you for joining us today as well for this event. I hope you've all taken something away, and that it may be a spark of a future idea or initiative. And if we've achieved that, then it can only help close the gap somewhat. Our next event is Connecting with Australians in Times of Need, and will be on the 9th of November with Shane Fitzsimons, the New South Wales 2021 Australian of the Year and ex-New South Wales Fire Commissioner, to talk about the importance of community connectedness before, during and after a disaster. And so I hope you can join me again. So thank you again to our panellists, and thank you to all of you, and stay safe.